Hey everyone, here's the less than 2-minute news report. I've been traveling for most of June and doing a lot of investigation. I've got a few projects underway to start prosecuting false accusers and start restoring due process to sexual assault trials. I'll be doing more videos on that soon, and I've had a number of people contact me with the right kind of help. Nothing is impossible in the world of Kekistan. Not to be too mysterious, but all good things in their time. Today, I want to talk about a different kind of mystery connected to the curious case of Daniel Holtzclaw. Hi, I'm Diana Davison. If you haven't heard about Daniel Holtzclaw, he's the all-American super cop and bodybuilding fitness nut from Oklahoma City who was framed for the unlikely crime of sexually assaulting numerous street prostitutes and junkies. As absurd as these allegations were on the surface, when you dig deeper, it gets even crazier. So how can such a high-profile criminal case be completely fabricated, I hear you ask? Well, let me show you. Let's start with an example. There is a currently unsolved murder case in Oklahoma County. It's unsolved because the police and prosecutors decided to frame someone instead of catching the real killer. But they got busted, and it fell apart. While you listen to this, remember, we're trying to answer the question of whether or not the police and prosecutors in Oklahoma County would be completely willing to fabricate evidence in Daniel Holtzclaw's case. When I'm done explaining this, I'll show you another connection. Get ready for the rabbit hole. So, in October of 2011, a 19-year-old woman named Carina Saunders was cut into lots of little pieces, and her body was found in a field with the parts shoved into a duffel bag. It was pretty gruesome, and, as you can imagine, the whole county was pretty worked up about finding her killer. 9 months later, 2 men were charged with her murder, Jimmy Massey and Ruiz. The case seemed pretty tight. Massey had confessed and named Ruiz as his accomplice, and 2 witnesses were found. One who said she was there when poor Carina was strapped to a table and had her foot sawed off while she was still alive. That witness claimed to have jumped out the window and run away when they started sawing off the second foot. The other witness said she was with Ruiz later, and when he left the room, she found a video of the murder on his phone. Again, she only watched it until the first foot was sawed off, and then she turned off the phone in horror. So, 2 witnesses, a confession. What could possibly go wrong? After 7 months in jail, waiting for the prosecutors to hand over their disclosure, Ruiz finally found out the date he was supposed to have murdered Carina Saunders. Well, it turns out he was in police custody at the time. Pretty rock-solid alibi. The whole case had been 100% fabricated. Massey's confession had been coerced. The witnesses were lying. The only reason Ruiz isn't on death row right now is because he had the good fortune to have gotten himself arrested. There is no doubt in this case that police manufactured evidence, and there is one more detail which is really important that you need to know about these fake witnesses. Well, both of them had lawyers. One witness had Mr. David Slane as her lawyer, and the other had a Mr. Scott Adams. This dismissal means they're having all sorts of problems with the case and with witnesses, Attorney David Slane said at the time the charges were dismissed. Attorney Slane represented one woman who claimed to have witnessed Saunders' death, but later recanted. Slane pointed out the dismissal does not mean Ruiz and Massey are free from suspicion. It was not a professional and unbiased investigation, said Oklahoma City defense attorney Scott Adams, who represented a woman once thought to have a video of the killing and dismemberment. That's why we're sitting here with the charges being dismissed. Adams' former client agreed to meet with the Bethany police in July, but never showed up because she was scared to come forward. Both of these witnesses had lawyers because they were facing charges themselves. Slane and Adams were representing them when they suddenly decided to lie about witnessing the murder. Quick note that almost all of Daniel Holtzclaw's accusers were also facing charges and looking for a deal. So we've got a false confession and 2 lawyers who each brought a fake witness, and now the lawyers are saying, well, it was shoddy police work and not their fault at all. It's the police's fault that the lawyers provided witnesses who were lying? As a result of the fabricated evidence trying to frame the wrong man, Carina Saunders' killer has not yet been found. Remember, this will connect to Daniel Holtzclaw's case. Stay with me. Now, the DA in Oklahoma County is David Prater. I've done a video on him in the past called The Most Dangerous Man in Oklahoma. Now, David Prater has gotten into a couple of ethical binds. He was being investigated for campaign fraud in 2010, but never fear, Scott Adams to the rescue. Mr. Adams gave interviews and media statements guaranteeing that his good buddy David Prater is the most ethical man we could ever know. In 2015, when David Prater had 2 witnesses arrested to stop them from giving exculpatory testimony in favor of a death row inmate named Richard Glossip, well, it was our other good friend, David Slane, who came out of the woodwork to save Prater's behind. This was a huge scandal. Prater interfered with 2 witnesses that could exonerate a death row inmate, threatening them and having them arrested. The media was going nuts. These 2 guys were arrested for minor unpaid fines and found themselves handcuffed in an interrogation room with David Prater's finger pointing in their faces and screaming at them. Never fear, this time it's David Slane to the rescue. Slane stuck his tongue so far up Prater's ass, I can only read it to you to explain. It's my belief that Prater simply wanted to interview Scott to ensure he's telling the truth. He had a legal obligation to talk to Scott, even if the circumstances were less than ideal. Lawyers, whether prosecutors or defense attorneys, have a right to interview all witnesses. And near the end, I make this comment publicly because I believe Prater to be a man and prosecutor who respects the law and will fight to do what's right, regardless of the end result. David Prater should be commended for what he did in Rogers County. Gosh, it must be nice to have 2 defense attorneys willing to make ridiculous statements to the media when you're in trouble, and even provide you with witnesses when you need to frame someone for a murder. All right, so what does this have to do with Daniel Holtzclaw? When Daniel was first arrested in a state of bewilderment, several attorneys approached him in jail and offered to represent him. But when it came time to decide which lawyer to use, the only 2 Daniel had to choose from were District Attorney David Prater's personal bootlickers, Scott Adams and David Slane. Now, I'm not a big believer in coincidence. Not only were the accusations against Daniel racially charged in the year of the Ferguson riots, with protesters chanting and taking photos of the jury members, we have complainants who had the accusations solicited from them in a county where the 2 top recommended trial lawyers were complicit in providing the state with false witnesses themselves in the Carina Saunders murder, just less than 2 years earlier. Daniel ended up hiring Scott Adams to defend him, and I'll leave you with the section from Daniel Holtzclaw's appeal that has to do with ineffective counsel. In other words, his lawyer sucked balls, and I'm making the case that Daniel's lawyer sucked District Attorney David Prater's balls. Scott Adams, among other things, had the Holtzclaw family pay for their own DNA expert. Good idea. It was the linchpin of the case against him, a trace amount of DNA from one accuser, whose purse had been searched by Daniel the day before his uniform was collected. And inexplicably, Adams never called the rebuttal DNA witness, even though it could be shown that there was no trace of body fluids and that the DNA was mixed with other unknown DNA, in contrast to what the prosecutors asserted. What we now know about that DNA, debunking what the claims were on the stand, comes from a DNA expert who came forward after the conviction. Why did Scott Adams hire a forensic expert and not call him to the stand? Why did Scott Adams, Daniel's lawyer, only spend a paragraph in his closing argument rebutting the incorrect assertions about the DNA in this case? Why did no one in Oklahoma County ask why Scott Adams and David Slane didn't suffer or even get questioned after producing fabricated witnesses against an innocent man in a murder case? Why did David Prater not get investigated for interfering and intimidating witnesses in the Glossip case? How many innocent men are going to go to prison before the corruption in Oklahoma is put to an end? There's a lot more you need to know about the case of Daniel Holtzclaw. Start by watching Michelle Malkin's 2-part series called Daniel in the Den. Link is below. And then I'll take you further down the rabbit hole. For now, let's just agree that Daniel Holtzclaw needs a new trial, and he needs a lawyer who doesn't answer to David Prater. And he needs a trial in a state which isn't controlled by David Prater. So, not Oklahoma.